Okay. All right. So is the King Arthur story based on a historical figure, or is it all made up? And how much is historical? So as I said, I put this together because I like seeing everything all at once. And I have so much material on King Arthur, and there is so much material written about him that it was helpful to me to see from the earliest reference, which actually Arthur is not mentioned, in 540, all the way up to 1470. Now, we could have gone to 2020, but I don't have enough room for that. So we're doing the literature from the earliest days until 1470. Now, you all read Geoffrey of Monmouth and Sir Thomas Malory. Now, there are different kinds of accounts when you're talking about Arthurian literature. A chronicle, which is see here, or a romance. Romance does not mean the same way we use romance today, as in love. Romance just refers to the language of French, right? So it's a different meaning for romance. It's the language of medieval French. So was King Arthur a real person?
Maybe, maybe not. His legend comes from sub-Roman Britain. We don't have any records going that far.
Okay. Any other ideas? Was King Arthur a real person? Who says maybe? Who says definitely not? Okay. Who says absolutely? Okay. So there is a lot of circumstantial evidence supporting the existence of a leader, general, king named Arthur in the mid-5th century. Now, what did we say in the first class and last week? What's happening in the mid-5th century in England?
The collapse of Roman rule.
So the Romans have left and there's a vacuum of leadership now. And who's coming in?
Germans.
Angles, Saxons, Jutes are all coming in.
And they're fighting with the Britons.
And in this time period, that's when a person named Arthur lived, who was not a king, but was more a general, exactly. Now, in my personal opinion, there is enough proof to say that somebody in this time period named Arthur existed, and it was on this person that all the myths have arisen. Due to many sources written over hundreds of years, and many of them mentioning Arthur, it seems probable that the writings, that the myth of Arthur originated in a person who led battles in Britain around 460. The no smoke without fire argument is one of my arguments, and there's a lot of smoke swirling around somebody named Arthur. So what was the original spark that generated all of that smoke? What convinced me is not just the historical documents, but also other evidence, which evidence may be too strong a word, but other happenings around the time. For instance, I found what it may be completely unconvincing to you, but I found quite compelling, that near the end of the 6th century, the name Arthur experienced a big resurgence. Everybody was naming their son Arthur. So popular historic figures often paved the way for a plethora of namesakes. And there's really no other plausible explanation for all of a sudden everybody wanting to name their son Arthur, unless there was an Arthur who was admired and beloved. Who he was, we don't know. So that's one possible brick in building our wall of if there's a real Arthur. Arthur is included in some accounts where all the other figures are historical. And one is the Easter Annals, or the Annals Cambrai. Everybody else who's mentioned is historical, so to me it makes sense that Arthur is also historical. There are references to Arthur beginning in 550 AD. So looking here, also, so we have the different authors, the different languages, Latin, Welsh, Anglo-Saxon, French, and English. And is it a chronicle or a romance? So the first writing doesn't actually refer to Arthur by name, but it has the setting of what's happening in the fighting, and that's Gildas in 540, written in Latin. So we have this post-Roman Britain and writing about the chaos and the resistance. And so that's the first kind of source, even though he's not mentioned specifically. Then we have E. Gododin, okay, written in Welsh. If I could say that in Welsh, it would be wonderful. That's 550 to 600. And the interesting thing about this source is it mentions Arthur only in comparing somebody else to him. So it's the author wrote, glutting black ravens on the wall of the fort, though he was not Arthur. So this is referring to killing a lot of the enemies. This general who was killing them was very adept at war, but he was not Arthur. So this is the first mention we have of Arthur, and it's comparing somebody unfavorably to Arthur, who was a better king. Then we have Bede, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 731. No mention of Arthur in that one. The next very significant one in 800, we have Nennius in his Historia Britonum, written in Latin. He mentions Arthur the soldier, that Arthur fought against the Saxons with the king of the Britons, and he was commander of the battles. Okay, so we have this comparison of Arthur to others, and then we have Arthur as the commander of battles. Then we have the monks who wrote the Easter Annals. So as you know, some holidays are on the same day every year. Christmas is December 25th. Some holidays are based on a lunar calendar. Ramadan is based on a lunar calendar. Easter is based on a lunar calendar. So it's different every year. So the monks had to get together and figure out when Easter would be every year. And that is part of what the Easter Annals is. So they're chronological tables to determine the dates of Easter. And it says in the year 490, the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur bore the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and nights, and the Britons were the victors. Okay, so again, we don't see a king, we see a leader of battles, written in an account where all the other figures are historical, so good evidence to say Arthur is a historical figure. Then we have Geoffrey of Monmouth, and Geoffrey of Monmouth was a clerk and a cleric, and he took it upon himself to write the history of the kings of Britain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. He really ramped up the Arthur story and added a lot to it. And as we said last week, the idea of a writer in that time period is not, I'm coming up with something original, my own independent idea. He scraped together a lot of sources, Celtic sources, myths, legends, history, wove them all together into the history of the kings of Britain. So here we have, as you guys read, Arthur's conception story, which involves some help from Merlin and involves sleeping with another man's wife. We have the conquest of the Roman emperor. We have Guinevere's adultery. In this case, it's with Mordred. Is the Arthur myth confusing? Yes, because different characters are paired up with different people and do different things according to whoever you're reading. So if you get confused, don't worry. You're in good company, because it is confusing, because there's so many different stories. And in one, Morgan Le Fay is a good character. In one, Morgan Le Fay is a bad character. In one, she's his half-sister. In one, he's sleeping with her. Who the heck is she, right? So it depends on what you're reading, who the character is, including King Arthur. Arthur is mortally wounded. In Geoffrey of Monmouth, what does it mean to be mortally wounded? You're going to die,
Yeah.
okay? A good friend of mine told us recently that she was on hospice. So my friends and I were debating, she's on hospice, to me, that means she's dying. You're mortally wounded, that means you're dying. She did die after about 2 weeks, but some of my friends were saying, well, you could be on hospice for different reasons. If you hear the word hospice, somebody is close to death. If you hear mortally wounded, somebody is going to die. So Arthur is mortally wounded, and in the next line it says they take him to Avalon to heal his wounds.
Doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. But he is the king who was and will be. And Thomas Mallory's words in that were very prophetic, because King Arthur lives on today in his stories. Right, we said in the first class and in all my literature classes, what survives is the story. The writer doesn't survive, the people come and go, but the story is what survives. And the stories that we're reading have survived for a couple thousand years, right? So we have Geoffrey of Monmouth. Then we have, any French speakers in the room? Speak French?
No.
Chrétien de Troyes. I'm not a French speaker. So now we have more stories in French, and all of these writers are taking what has gone before and adding to them, right? So he writes about Lancelot, Yvain, and Percival, and he uses rhymed verse. Knights are serving God, they're serving their king. The word worship is used a lot. They're worshiping the women, they're worshiping their king. So we have a lot of stories from him. Then we have Marie de France, right in the same time period, 1170. Marie from France, Marie de France, although she's living in England, she's writing in French. We have an English translation. And who is the main character in her story? Lanval. And who else is a major character? King Arthur's a minor character. In Lanval, the fairy queen. And fairy in this time means otherworldly, not like a fairy who's flying, right?
Mystical, like that.
Yes. So it's a flip on the man who comes in and rescues the damsel in distress. We have a gorgeous queen who comes in and rescues the knight in distress on a white horse. So this is a flip of that typical story of the damsel being
But
rescued.
does it get flipped back at the end? Because usually they do the flip, right, for comedic effect, and then they bring it back.
So what are you saying?
Like, it's ridiculous, right? Because it goes against norms, but then somehow it comes back.
Yes, but is it ridiculous is the question,
Well, for
right?
time is what I'm saying.
And if you guys read when the two ladies come in at the end, when King Arthur has to decide what to do with Lanval because he dissed his wife. And did anybody recognize a biblical story in what Queen Guinevere said Lancelot did? So Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of trying to rape her when actually it was Potiphar's wife that was trying to seduce Joseph. So this biblical story is repeated almost exactly in Launval, right? So he wasn't trying to seduce the queen, she was trying to seduce him, and he said, I got a lady that's far finer than you, which was his mistake because he was supposed to keep it a secret, right? So very popular, and so King Arthur and Queen Guinevere are kind of minor characters. We see Sir Gawain in a lot of these. He's a very important secondary character in a lot of stories. We see him in Geoffrey of Monmouth, we see him in Mallory, we see him in Launval. Then we have the Vulgate cycle, which we don't know who the authors were. That's written in French. That's considered a romance, again, in the French language, a story. And this cycle expands, multiplies, and complicates a lot of the previous material. We get the history of the Holy Grail, we get the story of Merlin, and the death of Arthur in the Vulgate cycle. So these are 5 other stories. Then we have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which we'll look at more closely next week. King Arthur is not portrayed as a strong, courageous king so much in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We have the beheading challenge, which would be kind of like Russian roulette. Spin the thing and I'll shoot you, and if the bullet is in the right chamber, you'll die. Wrong chamber, right chamber, you'll live. So they've had challenges like this time immemorial. It was a beheading challenge. You let me try and cut your head off, and then I get to try and cut your head off if I'm still alive. So in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight comes in on his green horse to King Arthur and Sir Gawain and all the men and issues a challenge. And Sir Gawain takes it up because he doesn't want his king to be killed. And he beheads the Green Knight. And what does the Green Knight do? He picks up his head, and the head is talking, and he rides off on his horse. See you in a year, Sir Gawain, and I get to do the same to you.
There's a movie coming out about it. It's just called The Green Knight, though.
Really?
Yeah, it's coming out in May.
Very interesting. So the story lives on, right? Okay, so Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and ending in this case, not ending because the King Arthur story continues, with Sir Thomas Malory, Mort d'Arthur. Interesting, Sir Thomas Malory, there's a couple of possibilities about who he was. When we're talking about literature this old, often we don't know who the author was, and sometimes we think we know, and sometimes there are a couple different people competing for who that could be. But probably who the Sir Thomas Malory was who wrote this was a convict in prison who was convicted of killing some people. He was generally kind of a bad guy. He had started out working for the government, and he kind of turned to the dark side, if you want to use the Star Wars analogy, and was trying to overthrow some of the leaders, and it killed several people. So he's in prison with nothing to do and writes Mort d'Arthur. It's probably the Sir Thomas Malory who wrote that, and you'll see in one version in the end, this is a very old copy of Mort d'Arthur, probably published in the 50s, and in the end he says, remember me and pray for me in prison. So we think that's who he was. So this is just a kind of an overview of all the different languages, the different time periods, and what they added to the story. Courtly love is a theme in a lot of Arthurian literature. And courtly love has different rules than we would think of today. So marriage is no real excuse for not loving. I'm just going to pull a couple of these out. No one should be deprived of love. Love is always a stranger in the home of avarice, so no greed. When a lover suddenly catches sight of his beloved, his heart palpitates. Every act of a lover ends with the thought of his beloved. A true lover is constantly possessed by the thought of his beloved. No, nothing forbids one woman being loved by two men or one man by two women. In courtly love, it is permissible and even encouraged to follow your heart, and if that means you love someone who's already married to somebody else, that's fine. So we'll see as the stories progress with King Arthur that this idea of courtly love becomes less acceptable, and in the beginning we'll see that in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So we're going to move on to a little more specific on the different authors. You can shut that